Custom-made devices are ruled out of several aspects of the MDR, but here we'll discuss some of the specific and distinct requirements that do not apply, or that do apply, pardon me. In this presentation, I'll cover inspection activities related to custom-made devices. I'll give an overview of the relevant requirements for custom-made medical devices that are there to ensure the devices are compliant. I'll talk through the requirement for all manufacturers, including those that manufacture custom-made medical devices, to have a formal quality management system in place. I'll give some insight into the documents that can be put in place to allow the competent authority, the HPRA in this instance, to understand the device's design, manufacture and performance, and to allow confirmation of compliance with the relevant requirements. I'll cover the requirement for prescription and what that might contain, and I'll talk about the Annex 13 statement that should be drawn up and accompany each custom-made medical device that is placed on the market. So, do the HPRA or other EU competent authorities conduct inspections of custom-made medical device manufacturer? The short answer is yes. Since medical device inspections commenced at the HPRA, custom-made devices have always been considered for inclusion in each annual market surveillance plan. Article 93 of the MDR reinforces this, as there is an obligation for competent authorities to carry out market surveillance and to have an annual plan in place. One activity included in that plan is inspections. Inspection planning is generally carried out in Q4 of each year for the following year. The planning considers all information gathered by the competent authority in determining the market surveillance activities that are needed for the following year. So right now, we're compiling data that will be used to derive the plan for 2024, and that will include a list of candidates that will be subject to inspections. Inspections are conducted to assess compliance with the requirements of the MDR and can result in the issuance of a non-compliance report in the event that deficiencies are identified. Looking back on data from 2016 to date, approximately 10% of the inspections conducted so far were of custom-made medical device manufacturers. During an inspection, evidence of compliance must be available from the inspectee. That is, documents, records, procedures, etc. must be in place. Verbal explanations of how things work are fine to summarize things, but they must be substantiated by documented evidence. A good rule to keep in mind is, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. Typically, during an inspection, there will be a review and assessment of quality management and regulatory compliance, a review and analysis of procedures and records. Information will also be gathered through interviews with relevant personnel, and usually there'll be an inspection of the premises, the equipment being used, the manufacturing processes, storage, etc. This is by no means an exhaustive list of what we would look at on an inspection. Over the remainder of this session, I'll give you examples of the types of documents that we expect to see that would aid in demonstrating compliance to the requirements of the MDR. So what are the requirements for placing a custom-made medical device on the market? My colleagues have mentioned these already, but just to reiterate, to legally place a device, including custom-made devices, on the market, or to put them into service, the device must comply with the requirements of the MDR. Whose responsibility is it to establish and confirm compliance with the MDR? Well, the responsibility lies with the manufacturer. The manufacturer must establish full compliance with the MDR. To do this, every element of the MDR must be reviewed for applicability, and only the specific exclusions and exemptions can be omitted from the approach to compliance. Now let's look at some specifics. Let's start with Annex 10, Part 9, that manufacturers are obliged to have a quality management system in place. The manufacturer is required to put in place a formal set of procedures, documents, and records that are implemented, kept up to date, and improved over time. This will be the quality management system, or the QMS, and this system should ensure compliance with the MDR. There are specific mandatory elements that must be included in the quality management system at minimum, but these can be expanded upon as needed to support the business further in achieving compliance. In the next few slides, I'll go over the required elements for the quality management system in order for it to be considered compliant. There are many elements to Article 10, Part 9, and I'll go through each of these in turn, giving examples of the types of procedures and other documents that you might have in place that would demonstrate compliance. With procedures come records, and many procedures will have defined outputs such as logs, forms, and folders of related documents. All of these together should demonstrate compliance with the MDR. The examples I gave are just that, examples, and other documents could be just as relevant to have in place as long as they contain sufficient relevant information to demonstrate compliance. Excuse me. The first element, Part A of Article 10, Section 9, states that the following is required: a strategy for regulatory compliance, including compliance with conformity assessment procedures and procedures for management of modifications to devices covered by the system. Here, what we sometimes see are things such as quality policies or statements outlining a company's intention towards compliance and that the approach that will be taken is described. There might be a document in place that outlines how management are responsible for compliance with the MDR, and there might be a plan in place describing how this will be achieved. We would also generally see here that a company has implemented an internal audit process that will help measure and improve compliance, the outputs from which would be reports or possible non-conformities, which would be addressed through the quality management system and all fully documented. The second part of A is the management of device modifications. So we would expect to see a change control procedure, or more specifically, a design change control procedure, and that these are implemented and that all changes that have been made are documented and are in line with the processes that have been outlined. Moving on to Part B. This mandates that the manufacturer must identify and address the applicable parts of the general safety and performance requirements that are outlined in Annex 1. Here, a GSPR checklist is very often the document used to show which requirements apply and which don't. Where a requirement is determined to be non-applicable, there should be a sound justification documented within the checklist. Where GSPRs are relevant to the device in question, a clear and unambiguous link or reference to a document, record, or procedure should be made to demonstrate where it can be shown that the requirement is being met. This exercise should be completed for all elements of Annex 1. Part C of Article 10, Section 9 requires that the responsibility of management be addressed. Here again, we often see quality policies and statements outlining how management in a company intends to fulfill regulatory requirements. We would generally also see a quality system manual or a procedure detailing management responsibilities in delivering regulatory compliance on behalf of the business. From parts A and C, you may have noticed that in some cases, one document can and may fulfill more than one requirement. So there is no need for a system to be overly complex. Part D of Article 10, Part 9 mandates that resource management, including selection and control of suppliers, be included in the quality management system. The expectation here is that resources such as raw materials are only purchased from suppliers that are controlled through some means of approval and ongoing evaluation or monitoring. You may have a supplier approval process, an associated approved supplier list. And where issues arise with material quality or supplier performance, these can be dealt with then formally through a corrective action activity, all of which would be documented within the system. Part D also covers other resource types, such as the premises. Is the premises fit for purpose? Is it appropriately clean? Is it fitted with all the required tools and equipment needed to manufacture the custom-made devices in a consistent manner? In addition, it covers things like equipment, maintenance, validation, and calibration where needed. And personnel. Do you have sufficient staff numbers, and are all of those staff adequately trained? The documents you may have are things like equipment logs with records of maintenance that's needed and completed, calibration due dates, labels on assets identifying them. You may also have training records and evidence of qualification of personnel in certain tasks. Moving on to Part E, Neva's already mentioned the fact that risk management is central to the manufacturer obligations, and this is reflected in the quality management system requirements also. Risk management must be built into the QMS. The best approach to doing this is to use EN ISO 14971 to guide you on how to integrate risk management principles throughout your business. What we usually see here is a risk management file. It would include things like hazard analysis, hazard evaluation, device and process failure mode and effects analysis, evidence that hazards that have been identified have been reduced or removed where possible, and that any remaining risks are acceptable. The risk documentation should conclude on the acceptability of the residual risks and make a call on whether the benefit of the device outweighs that remaining risk. Part F, which will be covered in more detail by my colleague Ivana coming up in the next presentation, states that the QMS must address the need for clinical evaluation to be conducted and the post-market clinical follow-up should be carried out where required. The QMS should dictate what data is collected for the purpose of compiling a clinical evaluation report and at what frequency that report should be updated. The data that you should be considering are things like peer-reviewed scientific literature, clinical investigations, alternatives to the device in question, and how they operate in comparison with respect to safety and performance. You should also be asking the question, is this device state-of-the-art? If it's not, why is it not, and is that okay? And if it is, show the evidence. Part G requires that product realization be addressed within the QMS. This can take the form of determining and documenting what is required in the areas of verification, validation, monitoring, measurement, inspection and testing, handling, storage, distribution and traceability activities specific to the product, and together with that, the criteria for the product acceptance. What you should be showing from this are the records that provide evidence that the realization processes and resulting product meet the requirements. Part H asks that the UDI is addressed, but as already mentioned, custom-made devices are exempt from the requirements related to UDI. So moving on to Part I of Article 10.9, this element requires that there be a post-market surveillance system within the QMS. Again, this topic will be covered in more detail in the next presentation. But to verify compliance with this requirement, the expectation is that the manufacturer would have a procedure outlining the approach to post-market surveillance, plus the manufacturer would have generated the related outputs from that process, such as a PMS plan and a report, and perhaps a post-market surveillance update report where required. Part J outlines the requirement to have mechanisms to communicate with relevant parties as needed. This includes communicating with the likes of the HPRA or other competent authorities, communicating with notified bodies if relevant, and also other economic operators, customers, and users. The approach to communication can be different depending on the stakeholders in question. For example, you could outline how you will communicate with suppliers and other economic operators within the agreements that you hold with them. You could have a process that outlines if and when communication with competent authorities or notified bodies are needed, how those decisions are made, and that the correct conclusion has been come to. Also, this could be, for example, include relevant details such as business hours and out of hours contact details for any relevant contacts that you need. My colleague Ivana will cover communication with the relevant parties in the event of customer complaints, but clearly a procedure for the recording and processing of customer feedback and complaints must be part of the QMS. Deciding if a communication for a customer is a complaint or not should be guided by your QMS, and any decisions made should be rationalised in your records. Again, Part K will be handled in more detail in the next presentation, but again for the QMS, a procedure should be in place that details what vigilance reporting means for the business, how the decisions are made, documented and reported to the relevant competent authorities where required. Part L calls for a method for managing corrective and preventive actions and for the verification of effectiveness of any actions that are taken. There should be a procedure that describes how to eliminate the causes of nonconformities by conducting CAPAs, and the procedure should give step-by-step instructions on the likes of risk assessment, investigation, and determining root causes of issues. The inputs to this process can be from any other part of your quality management system or from outside of the QMS, such as complaints received from customers or communications that are received from competent authorities. The work done in all stages of CAPAs must be recorded. Any actions identified should be documented and implemented in such a way that the story of the CAPA can be retold to external stakeholders if needed. The actions identified should correct and prevent recurrence of the issue that triggered the process in the first instance. Verifying that the actions taken have had the desired effect and have not introduced any new risk or adverse impact on the device should be carried out for all CAPAs and of course recorded. How this verification check will be carried out should always be outlined in advance of the implementation of any actions. Moving on to the final element of Article 10, Part 9, M. This section requires the manufacturer to use all the data collected throughout the life cycle of the product and from the implementation of the QMS for monitoring, measuring, and analysis in order to facilitate product improvement. To monitor, measure, and analyze, you need data, and for that, the QMS must be in constant use and not just there to fulfill the requirement of the MDR. The data collected can provide a roadmap to improvement by identifying trends and highlighting issues within current processes. This requirement can be addressed in many ways. For example, building tracking and trending into all relevant processes, or having one overarching procedure that outlines the collection and use of data from throughout the QMS. Collecting the data is only part of the picture. Analysis and critical evaluation of the results must be part of the planned activities in the QMS. This can happen in periodic meetings such as management review or more regularly if it's appropriate. All of the parts of Article 10 are there to give clues on what is needed for a company to be able to demonstrate consistently that the company and the devices manufactured are compliant with the MDR. As James has mentioned in the first presentation, not all custom-made devices require notified body involvement. In fact, as I've shown here, the vast majority don't. Quality Management System certification is only mandatory for Class 3 implantable devices. But whilst it's not mandatory for all, it certainly can be done on a voluntary basis. The desired Quality Management System certification for medical device companies is usually EN ISO 13485-2016. This is a standardized approach to implementing a QMS and is designed to be used by organizations that are involved in any and all aspects of medical device realization. Certification requires the QMS to conform to the standards clauses and for that conformity to be assessed by way of audits by certification or notified bodies, depending on which is required. Now, let's move on to the other documents that a manufacturer of custom-made devices should have available. These documents should be controlled by or within the quality management system. Again, in Article 10, Part 5 in this case, it's called out that the manufacturer shall draw up, keep up to date and keep available for the competent authorities documentation in accordance with Section 2 of Annex 13. And that documentation should allow an understanding of the design, manufacture and performance of the custom-made device. This documentation should support every aspect of the device life cycle and should allow an assessment of conformity with the requirements of the regulation to be completed by the competent authority. As called out here, the requirement, also called out here is the requirement to name on the record other manufacturing sites or sites in general that are involved in the realization of the custom-made device. This would include outsourced elements of the process or contract manufacturing services that are being used. Section 2 of Annex 13 and the general safety and performance requirements are very closely linked. The documents that are referenced in the GSPR checklist that I've already talked about will constitute the documents and records that allow for the understanding of the device manufacture and performance of the device. Next, I'll go through each of these categories in turn, starting with design. To substantiate the design and demonstrate conformity to the competent authority, there are many documents and records that you may have that could be referenced. I've listed a few things on this slide that are related to design and development. I won't go through them all, and what is put in place is completely dependent on the type of custom-made device we're talking about. For example, the documentation for a custom-made dental device will be entirely different to that of a knee and foot orthotic. But for all, there are some common or basic pieces of information that should be in place. For example, a description of the basic or core device, the intended purpose of the device, the classification arrived at for the device. Otherwise, documents such as technical drawings, computer-aided design inputs, and verification of those, material selection, and mutual and biocompatibility where required, could all be used to demonstrate that a device is designed in a way that is compliant with the general and safety performance requirements and to the broader requirements to comply with the regulation. Other elements such as the prescription and associated available customizations should be part of the documentation along with things like shelf life studies, label templates, and other things like that. Now let's look at the documents that could allow for a good understanding of manufacturing. Again, I've listed out many possible types of documents and records related to manufacturing that could demonstrate traceability of materials and outline manufacturing methods used. Records related to supplier controls and raw material incoming inspection will provide understanding of the selection and monitoring of the quality of the materials being used. Records that are relevant to the manufacture of a finished device, such as completed work orders or sterilization records if relevant, and further, the confirmation that the methods being used have been validated or revalidated at a defined frequency would all support the demonstration of compliance. Also, details about things like planned in process and finished product testing and the result of same should be completed and maintained and would further substantiate the claim that a device is compliant. The Annex 13 statement that has already been mentioned by my colleagues is also integral to understanding the design and manufacturing, as it is the final document related to a specific device that is compiled, and it indicates all variable inputs that were contained within the prescription, with the output being, in theory, a compliant device. Demonstrating the performance of the device and allowing an understanding sufficient to assess conformity can again be done in several ways. In-process and finished device testing can show that the device is operating as expected before it is being placed on the market. Predefined tests and records of the completion of those tests for custom-made devices should be documented and kept along with all other manufacturing records. Production information collected through post-production information collected through complaints or customer feedback and analysis of same can be used to demonstrate that performance is as expected or within expected thresholds. The documents put in place to answer the requirement for post-market surveillance, such as the PMS report or the PSUR, will aid greatly in allowing a reviewer to understand if the device is performing as anticipated. Where a device is not performing as planned, it is expected that the company will have identified this through their QMS processes, and monitoring and measuring activities will have commenced or completed an improvement plan using their CAPA process as a management tool. Now let's address some other documentation that's mandatory for the manufacturer of custom-made medical devices. My colleagues have already introduced the requirement for there to be a prescription on record for every custom-made device that is made and placed on the market. Here we'll talk about the basic content of this document that will allow for the device manufacturer to commence. The MDR does not specify what is required within the prescription. But in order to complete the Annex 13 statement, which I'll speak about next, the following minimum elements should be included. The name of the patient or some other means of uniquely identifying the patient. This facilitates the device being provided to the correct person. The name of the prescriber and the associated health institution. This information allows the manufacturer to determine if the prescriber is an authorized person and hence whether they should accept the prescription or not. It also allows for the device to be provided back to the correct clinic or practice for onward provision to the patient or user. Then lastly, I've listed the prescription instructions, the specific design characteristics that are unique to the patient for the treatment or the support of a relevant condition. The prescriber can provide this information to the manufacturer by any means as long as it's retained within the manufacturer's records. In many cases, this process can be standardized by creating a prescription form or template that can be made available to prescribers to use as needed, but it's not mandatory. The last document that I'm going to mention is another required record that must form part of the documentation of the manufacturer. That is the Annex 13 statement. Again, my colleagues have already mentioned this, so I just want to reiterate this and I'll talk about the content. Just one point that I want to restate. The Annex 13 statement must be drawn up following the manufacturer of each custom-made device and it must be provided to the patient or user along with that device. The statement must include the following information. The name and address of the manufacturer, listing all sites. The name and address of the authorized representative, if applicable. The following must also be included. Data that allows the identification of the device. So a part number, a lot or work order number is usually what we see here. A statement that the device is intended for exclusive use by a particular person. And that particular person is uniquely identified as we described above. The name of the person who made out the prescription and where applicable, the health institution concerned should also be listed. In addition, the specific characteristics of the product as indicated by the prescription should be included. There should also be a statement that the device conforms to the general safety and performance requirements set out in Annex 1. This is not just a rubber stamp. The conformance must be confirmed and documented within the records held within the QMS. One other piece of information that must be provided where necessary. So where applicable, an indication that the device contains or incorporates a medicinal substance, including human blood or plasma, or tissues or cells of human or animal origin. As you can see, there are many elements of this document that could be static, and these can be made into a template with just the variable information being entered at the point where the device is complete and ready to be placed on the market. Annex 13 stipulates that this statement should be retained for at least 10 years after the device has been placed on the market and for 15 years where the device is implantable. Annex 9 Part 8 is also applicable, so the following information and records must also be retained for the same period. The quality management system documentation such as procedures, forms and any other associated appendices and records should all be kept. Procedures and techniques for monitoring, verifying, validating or controlling the design of the device and any corresponding documentation as well as data and records should also be kept. And where there's notified body involvement, any records related to substantial changes that have been implemented in either the QMS or to the design of the device must be retained. And finally, any notified body reports or decisions also fall under this retention requirement. So I hope this session has been useful and that you now better understand how a manufacturer of custom-made devices can demonstrate compliance when challenged. So let's just reiterate the important points. The 4 key mandatory elements to demonstrating compliance that I've discussed here today were the fact that you must have an operating quality management system in place. You must have sufficient documentation in place to substantiate the design, manufacture and performance of the custom-made device that allows the competent authority to assess conformity to the regulation. The device being manufactured must be based on a prescription provided by an authorized person. And finally, Each device must be accompanied by the Annex 13 statement when being placed on the market or put into service, and this does not always have to involve payment of any kind. Thanks for listening.